Welcome back to Speducation. I'm your host, Brandon Reed, and if this is your first time to my channel, a special welcome to you. Now, for those of you who were here last week, you may remember that we talked about the differences between an IEP and a 504. And the differences are pretty clear. IEPs are more extensive, whereas 504s aren't. But that is the lesson that we're going to talk about today. What exactly goes into a 504? So, without further ado, let's dive into today's lesson. Today's lesson, what goes into a 504? Now, unlike the IEP process, I'm not going to spend 6 weeks going over every single detail of a 504, because guess what? There isn't that much to a 504. Even though it's not as extensive as an IEP, it's still just as important, and it still serves a purpose to remove barriers for students. So, don't worry, we should be able to get through all of this in this video. As I said before, 504s are not as extensive as an IEP. They don't include things like goals, progress monitoring, transition assessments, provisions, special education programs and services, LRE, BIP, behavioral intervention plans, although 504s do include those as well, but there are a lot more sections to an IEP than there are with a 504. 504s typically involve the following: identification of why the student needs the 504, the reasoning behind it, the disability. Typically, those individuals that require a 504 have some sort of barrier that's preventing them from being successful. And so, in order for a student to qualify, well, they need to be able to identify what is the barrier. What exactly is it that's making it harder for the student to succeed? So that's the first thing that you would see in a 504. The next thing is the supports to help the student succeed, such as extra time, test read aloud, small group, extra breaks, set times for medication, in large print for test and assignments, preferential seating, behavioral intervention plans, etc. Now, if you noticed, all of these things that I mentioned, these supports, these are what we would call accommodations. And in an IEP, there is a section that's specifically designed for accommodations. But unlike a 504, an IEP has more than just accommodations. It has special ed services, and those services are tied into a goal that is linked to the student's disability. Whereas with a 504, we basically identify what is the reasoning for the need for the 504, and then we provide supports or accommodations to help overcome whatever that reasoning is, whether it's a learning disability, whether it's having trouble focusing, whether it's a medical condition, whatever the case may be. These supports or accommodations are meant to help the student be successful. Basically, 504s are designed to remove barriers that would prevent a student from being successful. Some students may need support, but wouldn't require the full force of an IEP, or they may not even qualify for one. Instead, all they would need help with is the removal of those barriers. Whereas with IEPs not only remove barriers, but they also provide specific plans that are designed to help a student achieve a goal related to their disability. That's why they are more extensive. So now you may have another question. Well, then who is in charge of a 504? Because it sounds like, well, special ed students, they need help from a special ed teacher. They have IEPs, so the special ed teacher is in charge of that. But wait a second, if my kid doesn't qualify for a special education teacher or for special ed services, but they do qualify for a 504, will they still be able to get support? Will somebody be overseeing that? This depends. It depends on the type of school. Some schools, like charter schools, will require 504s to be handled through special education teachers. So, for example, for me, I work at the Excel Center. It's for adult learners, but occasionally we will get some 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds. Now, here's the thing. Because the special ed population here is substantially lower than it would be in a traditional school, I handle the IEPs and the 504s. And that's typically the case if you go to any kind of Excel Center here in Indiana or across the country. Typically, special ed teachers handle IEPs and 504s, but some schools have more special needs students than they do 504s. And other schools have more 504s than they have special ed. So it just depends on the type of school. Whereas other schools might have a 504 coordinator that handles these. Now, I have worked at a lot of different schools. The one thing that I haven't seen is a 504 coordinator. Now, I would assume that that would probably be somebody that works at a private school or maybe a Catholic school where they don't have a lot of disabilities, but they do have some students that do require support to overcome barriers. And in that case, you would have somebody like a 504 coordinator who would handle all of those. And then other schools might have school counselors overseeing the 504s. Now, when I was working for Perry Township at one of the middle schools, the counselors were actually in charge of the 504s. So they were the ones that were making sure that the 504 was being followed by the general ed teacher and that every year they would have a 504 meeting where they would meet with the student, they'd meet with the parent, and then they would discuss the 504 and what changes need to be made or whether or not the student still requires it. So you've gone through the testing and you found out that your child doesn't qualify for an IEP. So you're probably thinking, well, wait a second, my child needs help. Where is he going to get that? Can he still get help? Yes. Oftentimes, students that may not qualify for special education services can still be provided support through a 504. And remember, unlike an IEP, a 504 will follow you well into adulthood. Here working at the Excel Center, I work with a lot of students that are in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I have even worked with students that are in their 50s. And there can sometimes be barriers that prevent them from being successful. And that's where a 504 comes in. If these individuals had an IEP when they were in middle school or high school, once they turn 22, they no longer qualified, but they can still receive support through a 504. That's another big difference between an IEP and a 504, is that IEPs are designed for individuals that are in secondary education or primary education. So basically, third or fourth grade all the way up through 12th grade. Once a student turns 22, then they aren't allowed to have an IEP anymore. But that doesn't mean that they can't get support. They can. They just have to switch it over to a 504. Hopefully now you understand 504s a little bit better, and hopefully it's not as intimidating. But if you have any questions about it, feel free to post some questions in the comments section, and I'll be more than happy to answer. So what will we be learning about next time? Well, next week, we'll talk about acronyms in special education. Now, if you're wondering what an acronym is, it's actually something that you've heard before. If you've been with me from the very beginning, you may have heard something called an IEP. This is an acronym. It stands for Individualized Education Program. And basically what this means is that acronyms are used in special education, they're used in medicine, because it's a lot easier to say IEP than saying Individualized Education Program or Individualized Education Plan, because that's a mouthful. But if you can narrow it down to IEP, then you've got the hang of it. It makes it a little bit easier. And there are a lot of acronyms in special education. We're not going to go through every single one of them in the next video, but occasionally we'll come back to it and we'll learn about some of the different acronyms you might hear. And if you liked what you saw, please click the like button. And if you want updates on future videos, feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And this is primarily for my son because he's really interested in becoming a YouTuber. So the more likes and subscribes that I get from viewers, the more likely it is that he's going to say, "See, Dad, I told you I can make a career out of being a YouTuber." So I can't believe I'm saying it, but prove my son right. And please click and like and subscribe. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to post in the comments and make sure to share this channel with others, because the purpose of this channel is to get this information out to those individuals that would benefit from it. So the more people that see my channel, the more likely it is that it's going to help others. And until next time, class dismissed.